So welcome to another Forge webinar. My name is Fezo Mtonti. I am the Performing Arts Programmer at the Forge. This week, our webinar is a celebration and a remembrance of Professor Wamba-dia-Wamba, who was a dedicated and outstanding political thinker and organizer, militant, educator, theorist, and committed Pan-Africanist and working class internationalist. Today, we hope to remember his work and its importance to Pan-African praxis and thought. And helping us to do that today are Professor Angie and Professor Michael Neo-Cosmos. A little bit about Professor Angie. Angie is a Kenyan with more than 40 years experience in international development, health and human rights, and is the founder and publisher of Daraja Press, including hosting the online interview series Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. He's an adjunct professor at the Institute of African Studies and contract instructor, Carleton University, Ottawa in Canada. Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy, Berlin, visiting fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies. He is also the founder and former editor-in-chief of Pambazuka News and Pambazuka Press. He has published widely on health and human rights development and politics. He is co-editor with Sokari Ekene of African Awakenings, The Emerging of Revolutions, and co-editor with Bell Fletcher Jr. of Claim No Easy Victories, The Legacy of Omka Cabral. Then we have Professor Michael Neo-Cosmos, who is an emeritus professor in humanities at Rhodes University in South Africa and a distinguished visiting scholar at the University of Connecticut Humanities in the United States. He is the author of many articles and several books, including From Foreign Natives to Native Foreigners, Explaining Xenophobia in South Africa, and Thinking Freedom in Africa Towards a Theory of Emancipatory Politics. This last book was awarded the Frantz Fanon Prize for Outstanding Work by the Caribbean Philosophical Association in 2017, and he's currently working on a book provisionally titled The Dialectics of Emancipation in Africa, to be published by Daraja Press, as well as an anthology of African political thought from ancient Egypt to the present, funded by Cadastria. So like I said before, Wamba-dia-Wamba had an incredible legacy as a militant Pan-Africanist intellectual and organizer, and he will continue to be remembered by his works and his actions through thousands of people, particularly the young people his teachings and practices influenced in the last years of his life. Up until the end, his depth of human resilience and rigor of organizing remained rooted in revolutionary praxis. And these are some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. Wamba-dia-Wamba was born in 1942 in Democratic Republic of Congo during the brutal Belgian colonial rule. At the end of his secondary schooling in Swedish mission schools, he was awarded a scholarship to study in the United States at Western Michigan University, where he attained a bachelor's degree in economics and philosophy. He went on to obtain an MBA in Claremont. During his time as a student in the United States, Wamba-dia-Wamba was actively involved in the civil rights movement. Later, Wamba-dia-Wamba made his decision to root himself both geographically and practically in the struggles of the African masses, and in 1980 began to teach at the University of Dar es Salaam. He was decisive in using the education he received in the service of his people, both culturally and materially. Wamba's contribution to Pan-Africanism can be traced back to his time in the US, where he was involved in Pan-African movements. Throughout his life, he remained committed to building Pan-Africanism rooted in the masses and not an African elite. Wamba's lifelong dedication to building Pan-Africanism is well documented and includes contributing to developing Pan-African theory. In line with this stood his championing of African egalitarian practices, most notably known through his elaboration on the communal palaver, and where the practices of carving out space where any person may speak critically about communal affairs and leaders, communities to remain classless, evenly governed, and accountable. Wamba-dia-Wamba has been pivotal in struggling towards building a liberated post-colonial Africa, where revolutionary leaders such as Cabral struggled towards Africa's independence from colonial and imperialism. Leaders such as Wamba-dia-Wamba have continued to struggle post-independence against the clutches of capitalism and imperialism. Wamba-dia-Wamba dedicated his life to fighting tirelessly to expose capitalism's contradictions in post-independent Africa. Throughout his life, Wamba has held resolutely that Pan-Africanism is to be built by the masses for the masses. He was critical of both institutions which sought to loot Africa and the continent's ruling elites, whom he characterized as being removed from the people. In his last years, Wamba was engaged in developing political discussion groups and engaging Pan-Africanist activities in Dar es Salaam. He sustained warm relations with activist movements and radical intellectuals across the continent, including in South Africa, where he has been known as a leader by the social movements and trade unionists. So maybe to start us off, we can think about Wamba's critique of a neo-colonial state. Professor Angie, do you have some kind of preliminary thoughts about the contributions of Wamba here?
Well, I think, well, before anything else, just to say, to convey condolences to the family and to all the militants that we've lost a brother and a comrade, who is featured just behind me here from the recent article by Michael Neocosmos in New Frame. I think one of the most important contributions that Wamba made on this issue was to point out the continuity of the colonial state with the neo-colonial state. That neo-colonialism is a new form of the same substance. He pointed out how under colonialism, the whole life, body, politic, economy was imprisoned by the colonial rules. Today, under neo-colonialism, our states are more accountable to the big financial institutions, to the transnational corporations, etc. They're more accountable to them than they are to the people who supposedly elected them. I think the key thing of that Wamba pointed out, and maybe Michael will want to comment further on this, and that is that, that he points out, as did Cabral, that by occupying the colonial state, and the apartheid state is only another form of colonialism, by occupying it, you cannot deliver to what the people need. That it's, Cabral put it very clearly, that you have to destroy the existing colonial state and its machinery if you're going to be able to build an alternative state that's built on people's democratic people's participation. And I think this is something that Wamba held very close to his heart, and his critique of our leaders, so-called, was to point out that they are the continuity of perhaps the new prison guards of those of our societies which are imprisoned by capital.
Thank you very much, Rose. So connected to that, Wamba also thought quite deeply about popular democracy and its kind of relationship to Pan-Africanism and the ways in which Pan-Africanism can be used as an emancipative thought, if kind of contextualized and thought about in correct ways. Michael, do you have kind of reflections about what his work meant in this, and reflections on what Feroz has just said as well, connected to the idea of the neo-colonial state?
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have to start by understanding his comments on the tragedy of Lumumba, in a sense, because that illustrates the problems that all African leaders faced, at least those leaders who were serious about changing things at independence and building a society which was in the interests of the majority of the people. And that is that Lumumba comes to power and he thinks that by entering the state, he'll be able to fulfill his vision. And in fact, he has very little control over his own cabinet, let alone over other issues in the other institutions within the state. I mean, already, apparently, I mean, we say, Wamba was telling me this in some detail, that already when he has a meeting of his ministers, some of his own ministers are plotting against him and having meetings on the side. So the tragedy is that this man who was really committed to transforming his society doesn't have a mass base to be able to defend him when he's in power. And Wamba argued that this is really, so we can't just blame, in other words, we can't just blame imperialism for intervening, killing Lumumba in this particular instance, and continuing along a process of neocolonialism. One has to think, what were the problems with our politics? Or what were the problems with the politics at independence? And he argued that the politics of the problem at independence, the problem of the politics at independence was that it wasn't understood that you needed a mass popular base in order to be able to fulfill the project that you had about transforming your society and democratizing it. And this, he says, is the major tragedy of Lumumba and other progressive leaders who come to power at independence. So absolutely central, therefore, is the idea that you cannot enter the state and then think that you're going to be able to use it in order to transform society in a democratic way. But rather, you need popular movements to be able to provide you with support precisely when you come under attack. And this is absolutely fundamental in Wamba's thinking. That entering the state in itself is not sufficient. You may be forced to do it, yeah, but on its own, it's not enough. So, you know, of course, this doesn't talk about the people who didn't want to transform the state at all. But I mean, you know, taking Lumumba as an example was very serious and progressive. This is the fundamental problem. So you then come to the question of the popular movement. And these popular movements were not always existing. I mean, some countries had them, like, you know, there were mass movements in, say, Angola, Mozambique, whatever, but not in the DRC, not in Congo. And of course, when they did exist, and Fanon mentions this, as you know, one of the core ideas which mobilized people was the idea of Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism was therefore part of this alternative ideology which had taken root among the popular masses. We are all Africans, and so on. But I think, I mean, there's a different issue. Wamba went on, talked quite at some length to me about the history of Pan-Africanism. But maybe we can talk about that in a bit later. But the point about the state is that, as given the absence of popular movements, and even when they were present, the state, the post-independent state ends up being grafted, he says, on the colonial state. In other words, it's not transformed, or, you know, it's not destroyed. Well, even when it's, you know, the destruction or the transformation of the smashing is a Leninist formulation. But he argues that in fact it was simply grafted on, so that you have the continuation of state institutions which are foreign to the African people. Even after independence, the state is conceived as a foreign body, you know, which is imposed on people. So it's not rooted in people's culture. It's not rooted in people's ways of doing things. And that fundamentally is the result of the absence of any popular alternative on which the transformation of the colonial system could be based.
I suppose also he then asks us to think about managing a kind of common good as a
Yes.
necessary requirement, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's also useful for us as a kind of entry point into thinking about what an emancipatory politics is, which is asking us to move away from the dominant paradigms, which assume that people can't think, which absolves them of political agency and political thought.
Absolutely.
Maybe some of your reflections here, Michael, and then Feroz.
No, absolutely. I mean, and this is where this is fundamental to Wamba's thinking, because first of all, he goes all the way back to ancient Egypt to show that even under conditions of extreme inequality and oppression, there was some notion in ancient Egyptian culture which maintained that humans are linked to nature and to the universe as a whole. So that despite the inequalities, there is a notion that everyone must be treated with respect. And that this is fundamentally, this is evident in the Egyptian idea of Mat. But he goes on to argue through an analysis of his own culture that the palaver or mbongi is an example of how, despite differences, people's voices, all different voices can be heard, so that it provides some kind of understanding of what is common to the community in question. So what was fundamental to his thinking was this idea that you have to have an understand. If the state is going to manage the common good, if the state is going to be a state which represents the nation or society in general, there has to be some understanding of what that common good is. And that understanding can only develop through involving everyone in the society in one way or another, so that various opinions can be formulated. And as a result of the discussions of differences, because everybody's going to have a different perspective, as a result of bringing all these together, you come to some some creation or to some understanding that there's more that holds people together than pulls them apart. And if that is the case, then you can build what used to be called nation building on the basis of what is common, not just simply in the interests of the dominant group or the dominant class or whatever. So that was absolutely fundamental to his way of thinking, and that's how he thinks a different state should be constructed, a state that manages the common good.
Sure, and your reflections on this, Professor Angie?
I think it's very important what Michael has just said, and I think one of the best explanations about the fact that people do think comes from Michael's book, Thinking Freedom in Africa, which I think reflects many of the ideas that Wamba fought for over many years. I think that there have been examples of the formation of these kind of popular assemblies. I mean, if one looks at Guinea-Bissau in the time of Amilcar Cabral, he was very, very clear that what was required was that at every level, at every village and so on, there had to be a collective way of deciding what needs to be done, what the perception of peasants what were the priorities, and it allowed an experimentation. And I think there's a tendency for the left to be impatient. If you want to get something done well, it doesn't matter if it takes time, because it allows that discussion. It allows people, and it's showing respect that people do think and that they are able to come to conclusions. They may take time and they may make mistakes, but if independence, if self-determination isn't about the right to make mistakes, what is it about? Because frankly, I mean, I think, you know, Wamba was clear about, we only learn from our mistakes. And so making mistakes is part of a process of learning. And I think the important thing is that it allows an experimentation about solutions. And those solutions are particular to particular communities. And that is a really important thing, because there's a tendency for us to think there's an absolute solution, that we can just simply apply the following formula. You know, the left has been classic on this, in a sense of a mirror image of the neoliberal thinking that here's a standard formula, you know. But it's that creativity that gets released that is really exciting. I mean, I remember in the time before 1994 in South Africa, where there were meetings going on with incredible creativity happening. All of that got lost when it got absorbed into that whole process of state formation and the post 94 structures, which sucked out that and applied a standardized formula. But I think we have to acknowledge that in Africa, and it's going on today. One looks at what's going on in Sudan, the discussions that are going on the ground. In Tunisia, that has happened. In Algeria, that has happened. In Burkina Faso, it was an extraordinary experiment under Thomas Sankara. I think this is what Wamba was pointing out, that it is possible to do that. You don't have to just go the old neo-colonial route, which actually, all it means is that by taking over the state, there's no real transformation. The police who have been killing people under colonialism are simply dressed up in the national flag. The army is also dressed up in a national flag. And what's depressing is that those who were part of the military wing of liberation movements, like Umkhonto Sizwe, what happened? They get absorbed into the existing state armed forces, not the other way around. And I think that's really important in understanding what is actually going on. And the tragedy has been that in so many cases, these creativity or popular discussions and so on gets eliminated, gets absorbed because of a fear of centrifugal forces moving the interest away from the state and those who occupy it.
I mean, thank you very much for both of your contributions here. I think those were incredibly rich. But I think what Wamba is also able to show us in his work is how resistance and struggle also allow for new creative possibilities, and particularly the way that we think about social movements and their struggle, even in times of widened inequality and what we are now seeing with physical distancing. We're still seeing how resolute social movements like Abahlali Mjondolo are in the contemporary moment. And connected to that, maybe I just want to know about both of your reflections about how we can use the palaver as a kind of political methodology that's able to allow us to think about how social movements are able to move and think across this moment that is so uncertain and continues to plague us with different issues around the world, and particularly on the African continent. Professor Angie.
Well, I mean, perhaps Michael would be in a very good position to discuss this, because you were there in that period before 1994 and saw the rise of these kind of popular movements and the ability to have popular discussions going on about the future, and which got then transformed when the external wing returned to South Africa. But I do think that for one, visiting Abahlali, you get a sense that what is happening in the way they organize is to respect precisely this issue of not saying from on top what needs to be done, but allowing discussions and allowing errors to occur which the leadership may not agree with, but which happen. If you remember, a couple of years ago, they took a position of supporting the DA. But one has to respect that if one's going to get into a dialogue and discussion about it. And I think that's the really important, why I have enormous respect for Abahlali is precisely because they are not seeking to make it a centralized organization. They are trying to encourage that kind of debate on the ground. And it's not so much as social movements, but as people who are living in conditions which they want to change. And that's the important difference.
Sure.
Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. See, I think at the core of all politics, and this is something that Wamba understood, not many people understand it. At the core of all politics is a meeting. In other words, you have to have a discussion on what, not just simply on what is to be done, but before you even think about what is to be done, about what you want to do and how you're going to, and who you are and what unites you. You have to be united around a set of issues which you want to achieve. And then you can sit down and say, what is the best way to go and achieve them? But if you don't have that meeting, if you don't have that discussion, then, two things happen. First of all, the leadership ends up being coercive because it imposes its line and its position on everyone else without any discussion. And then, people feel alienated and feel excluded and say, well, what about us? And then as a result, you cannot have a collective answer to what is a collective problem, because it's a collective problem that you are facing. Transforming society or transforming your situation, whether it is Abahlali or whether it is at a higher level, requires constant discussion. And it's quite apparent that if the state and its representatives say, we have the monopoly of knowledge, which is precisely what they said, what the ANC said when it came to power. There's a famous article or written thing by, I think it was written by Thabo Mbeki, who says, we have the monopoly of knowledge. Everyone else is just speaking from their own narrow perspective. We have the knowledge which is for everybody, and we have the monopoly of knowledge. Then you exclude people, and it's quite. And then you say no. Our interventions are based on science, and then the scientists themselves come back and say, it's nothing to, we never said that. This is a political decision which you made, and we were totally excluded, even though, or rather, we were not listened to, even though we were included, apparently. So, I mean, this is what has happened here with this. The response of the state to the COVID thing is quite clear. That the science is used as a kind of fig leaf to justify interventions, but in fact, the scientists are ignored when it's not in the interest of the state to listen to them. So you have to involve everyone. You have to listen to people. If you're in power. And this has been a disaster because the South African state in particular has just not listened to what ordinary people do. In this particular context, it's patently obvious. Abahlali constantly saying, listen to us, we want to talk with you. Don't talk for us. Talk with us is their slogan, right? So listen to what we have to say, but they're not. they're not because they feel, as you and it's not possible to have a coherent response to major problems on that basis. You see, so the palaver is up, or something like a palaver, or a palaver, which is, in a sense, it's a form of democracy. It is what popular democracy is all about. Everyone must have a say. But because there is a system of representation, and some people say they represent others, whereas in fact they're constantly ignoring them, that is one of the fundamental problems. And the whole idea of representation was, of course, central to the Western conceptions of state democracy, whereas in Africa we had much more of a direct understanding of what democracy is. And I think we need to go back to that and to try to understand how that might be resurrected in the present conditions. And I think Abahlali is showing one way of doing it, and I think we must learn from it. Everybody must learn. When I say we, I mean I don't mean just academics or thinkers or militants or whatever. Everyone must try and get together and discuss these issues. The problem is they're being systematically marginalized and ignored. So
and repressed. I mean,
repressed.
What is happening in South Africa is using coercion, the militarization of the streets, as a solution to an epidemic which is fundamentally political.
Absolutely. And, I mean, that's precisely what happens if you don't have discussion. You resort to coercion.
It's exactly what's happening in Kenya. It's exactly what's happening in a number of African countries, and it's so easy. It's so easy to just reach for the weapon. When Cabral was assassinated by his own comrades, he was shot in the gut first. He tried to get up, and his last words were apparently, "Comrades, this is no way to resolve differences." And that epitomizes exactly the situation, that there is a tradition in seeking an aspiration to the state, being state-oriented instead of people-oriented, is that inevitably the use of repression is an instinctual response.
Yes.
You can't, in a sense, have one without the other. Even amongst social democracies that have emerged in so-called social democracies in Africa, or indeed looking at Latin America today, AMLO, for example, the incapacity to listen to what people are saying signals a danger for the coming period when those who have instincts to use the arms to achieve their ends will happen. We have seen it in numerous Latin American countries. We've seen it throughout the history of the last 50, 60 years of so-called independence in Africa.
Yeah.
You need to turn your...
It's your turn, Tracy.
I'm just kind of in closing, something that Michael had written in his tribute to Wamba, that his principles were founded on drawing on the axiom that people and people alone are the markers of emancipatory currents in world history. And I think you kind of touched on the ways in which Wamba was able to allow us to think through through this idea. So I'm just curious about your reflections as friends and comrades of Wamba-dia-Wamba, and kind of remembering him in this moment. Michael, if we can just start with you.
Regarding this particular issue, about the making of history, well, I think what Wamba was trying to do is I don't want to say operationalize, doesn't say so, but give content to that slogan. It's a very important slogan, but one has to give content to it. There are some people in this country who think that, it's social media. Social media are the makers of history, because social media respond to or give responses to what may be considered to be oppressive aspects of state interventions. But in order to give content to this, Wamba believed very strongly that people themselves have to act. But the difficulty he was facing in Congo is that there was no tradition of popular organizing independently of the state. So people tended to think in terms of let's find a leader and let's form a political party. Whereas he's saying, look, the problem is if you start thinking in terms of political parties, you end up again thinking about achieving state power and entering the state. The difficulty is thinking politics in a different way. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have an organization, but that organization should be one which is responsive to the pressures of independent popular movements. You can't follow the traditional route of forming political parties. And you have to rely in every process of transformation on the views or the organized views of the majority of the population. So when to use Cabral again, reference to Cabral, when Cabral says you have to return to the source, what he means is that you have to listen to what the organized people are saying, not just people, but organized people when they fight against colonialism. And Wamba was what he was arguing was very, very similar. And he said, in fact, Cabral's idea was absolutely right, because it was quite clear that the intellectuals and the leaders of his movement were, for the most part, assimilated into through Western education, through access to resources, etc., into Western modes of thought. So you had to be able to enter into, if you like, return to the source of organized people who thereby made their own history. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the making of the history and the entering into this popular movement are part of the same thing, because the tendency is for leaders, for the middle class and for the intellectuals to be tempted by sugar-coated bullets, if I may say, which is a famous expression also. So you have to try and break with this. Cabral used this idea of class suicide. I think it's not without its problems, but it gives you some idea that you have to break away from the instinctive or the automatic absorption into Western practices and modes of thought and whatever, and to listen to and to become part of a different way of doing things, which is a theme which, of course, you find in Fanon and in others. It's only when you go to this occult zone or whatever terminology, whatever formulation you want to use, and that is where history is being made. Otherwise, the world just continues more or less the same way. With just swapping of different people up there in power at different times. Now you have this one, now you have that one, but then everything continues as before, and it continues precisely. Neocolonialism is such a continuation.
Yeah.
So that's I think that's what it's about. So there has not been a remaking of history. It has not been sufficient simply to become independent. You know, that independence is shallow, is superficial. It's only there because you have a seat at the United Nations. And even so, you know, but ultimately, the people who run our states, are, as Firoz said right at the beginning, their interests are congruent with Western interests, and rather than with that of their people. So, you know, so it's a major tragedy. So that's why I think Wamba helps us to think a way forward, helps us to think different ways of thinking about transforming the world.
I think really crucial. I mean, it's not merely being able to listen to organized people, but it's also the politics that are involved. And by that, I mean, it's easy for intellectuals and theoreticians to talk about and define emancipation and what that means. But in practice, it is those conversations amongst organized people who give articulation to the specificities in that moment in history, in that place, what emancipation, what the pathway to the ultimate freedom of humanity, not just of themselves, but of humanity as a whole, is going to be. And I think that's what's really missing in that conversation about, because, you know, the historical task that we face is not, as Africans, of liberating Africa, but of recognizing that we have a sense, because of the oppressions, the experiences of colonialism, neo-colonial, we have a concept of the possibilities of what being human is about. And that, therefore, is a leadership function in that sense, to open conversations with others who have been up to now part of the oppressive machinery, to understand what the pathways to their own liberation has to be. And I think this is really important. I think why Wamba's writings are so important, but at the moment far too little acknowledged, is that very fact that it is out of the experience that we've had that the future lies, but it has to come from the specificities of discussions, the palavers and so on, of people who are directly involved in translating theoretical ideas into what it actually concretely means as a pathway forward.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that, if I may, if we have a few more minutes, because there has been this tendency on the left of, you know, having a theoretical perspective which we then kind of impose, or which has been imposed, rather than listening to the concrete ways, the concrete problems that people are facing on a daily basis. And it's out of that you can start thinking about some idea of universal emancipation. You always have to start from the concrete, not with some kind of abstract notion. And I think that's precisely where Wamba-dia-Wamba was going, and what his contribution to thinking politics in Africa and throughout the world was, fundamentally. And that means basically, as you say quite rightly, Firoz, you know, basing this on discussions and listening to what people are saying. Listening because people think. The people are capable of theorizing and thinking for themselves. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Neocosmos and Professor Angie. This was an incredibly rich and thoughtful conversation. And we'd like to send condolences to the friends and family of Professor Wamba-dia-Wamba. Thank you so much for tuning in.